certainly had a fair number of people contact me off the back of that interesting debate. But there are still a lot of people that quite understandably want answers to their questions, want an opportunity to ask those questions and to hear some perspectives. And as Yes Tweedale, that's what we've intended to do all along throughout this referendum campaign, is give you different perspectives from different people. And tonight is our last event in Peebles, certainly, along that line, so please do take the most of it, and we will have a lot of time for questions. We're going to start tonight with Ivan McKee from Business for Scotland. Now, if you haven't seen Ivan on YouTube, it's well worth a watch, but actually we're going to go one better tonight and you're going to see him in the flesh. Most people's concern about independence, it's not could we be independent, it's can we afford to be? And that's what Ivan takes head on. What are the numbers? How can one side say one thing and the other side say something that seems very contrary? What do they really look like? So we're going to start with Ivan first, and it does help to use some slides just to provide some perspective and some of the numbers. After that, we then have Marsha Scott, who will speak for Women for Independence, and finishing off with aplomb will be a former Chief Executive of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Andy Myles. First of all, let me just do a brief introduction of Ivan. So he is a very successful independent businessman from Glasgow. He's really done the numbers on the business of independence, from the real world of national wealth and opportunity to the economics of real people's lives. Ladies and gentlemen, Ivan McKee.
Thanks very much, Callum, and thanks for coming out tonight. I understand you're missing a Celtic game, so there we go, I'll put something on. I'll talk you through what I've got, and then there's plenty of time for questions afterwards. Clearly we're now into the interesting part of the campaign, so things are evolving day by day, new issues are coming up, so I'm sure there's a lot of things that we'd like to talk about in terms of what happened yesterday, for example. As Callum said, I'm going to talk you through the economic stuff. First point to make is there's a load of stuff on YouTube, so if you haven't seen any of the stuff that's there, go and put my name into YouTube and all kinds of things will come up, which so you don't need to remember all the numbers as we go. It won't be a test at the end, but as I say, if you want to recap on it or send it on to somebody else and you think might be interested, it's all there. First thing I'm going to talk about is my journey to Yes, why I'm here, and how I got involved. As Callum said, I'm involved in business. I've been involved in manufacturing business for 30 years all my working life. And for the last 9 or 10 years I've been running my own businesses, which have built up over the years, and now got a manufacturing business in Scotland, do business in England, and got a couple of factories in Europe as well. So quite a lot of stuff going on. Myself and my business partner involved in all around the place, export stuff all over the world. And when the referendum came up as a live issue a couple of years ago, I thought it made sense to go and have a look at what it was all about. It made sense for me, for my businesses. So I went and looked at it as if Scotland was a business. I ignored all the political spin, went and looked at the numbers, downloaded everything. There's loads of information there if you want to go and look at it. You can get umpteen spreadsheets and reports and whatever. So I went and downloaded all the stuff, looked as if it was a business of Scotland. Was a business, is it something you'd want to invest in, or is it something you want to steer well clear of? And what I found surprised me, because perhaps like you over the years I've been led to believe that we couldn't afford it, we were subsidised by England, we were too weak, etc, etc. And what I found out in fact was quite the opposite, and I'll talk you through some of the stuff there. We've got a limited time tonight, but as I say, there's a lot more detail on the YouTube stuff. So the first point to note is that this is a rich country, and anybody that tells you it isn't, will not tell you the truth. Scotland generates more tax per person than the UK average. That's the data for the last 5 years. Shows you how much tax take per person for Scotland, how much for the rest of the UK. The average over the last 5 years, Scotland generating £1,200 more per person than the UK average. That's the amount of money that goes into the government coffers from the population. It includes income tax, national insurance, VAT, corporation tax, road tax, whatever you name it, the whole lot, all goes into the government, and we divide that by the population, that's where we're at. So Scotland certainly generates the wealth, and there's absolutely no doubt about that, and presenting with the numbers, the other side can't argue against that. And it's not just for the last year or the last 5 years. If you go back over the last 33 years, which is back to 1980, when they first started collecting the data for Scotland separately, that's the chart there that shows you what that's all about. The dark line, the higher line, is Scotland's tax revenue per person, and the lower line is the UK average. And every year it's more, some years it's a bit more, other years it's an embarrassing amount more. But that's the reality of the income. We spend more in Scotland as well, and the other side will talk about that a lot. But the reality is, there's a number of reasons for that. We've got things here that we provide that we don't provide down south, tuition fees, prescriptions, etc. There's parts of the public services down south that are or are being privatised that aren't up here, so we spend more money on those. But when you look at it in around, the amount of extra tax we generate more than compensates for the extra spend we have in Scotland. The problem we've got is the fact that the opinion poll that came out last weekend of voters in the rest of the UK, only 12% of them thought that Scotland should be allowed to spend more per head if there was a no vote after the no vote. So the politicians and the public down south are very much gunning for reducing Scotland's public services, despite the fact that we generate more than enough money to pay for that through our tax revenue. And if you look back over the last, say look at the last 5 years, if Scotland had received the same percentage of tax or spend that we generated as the same percentage as the tax that we put in the UK, then that would have equated to an extra £8.5 billion. We're 8.5% of the population, we spend about 9.2 something percent of the total spend of the UK, but in tax terms we generate about 9.5%. So we do generate more percentage terms than anything we spend. And as I say, we had the same percentage out over the last 5 years. We had an extra £8.5 billion, £1,600 per person. And that's effectively what would have happened if we'd been independent. The other way to measure income is what they call gross domestic product, which is the size of the economy, how much economic activity and wealth the total economy is generating, not just the tax take. And again, if you look at those numbers, Scotland's richer than the rest of the UK. Last year, 11% higher, the year before 18% higher. It kind of hovers about an average of about 15% higher than the UK GDP. Interestingly, when you completely exclude oil and gas from those numbers, Scotland's GDP is the same as the UK average. So oil and gas is very much icing on the cake. It's the extra revenue that allows us to invest for the future. We don't need it, as I say, to be on the same level as the rest of the UK. And the question, of course, is do we want to keep that second half of the oil bonanza, because we're only halfway through. We want to keep the money from the second half here in Scotland, to allow Westminster to continue to waste it as they've done in the first half. So in GDP terms, which is how they measure the wealth of countries, Scotland in last year's numbers were in the 14th richest country in the world, the UK number 18. And interestingly, that's the list of the top 12 countries in the world, one of last year's numbers. And the interesting thing about that list is if you look at how many of those countries are similar sized countries to Scotland, similar position to Scotland in terms of North and West Europe, but also most of them have got far less natural resources in Scotland. There's lots of reasons why smaller countries do better. There was an interesting report coming out from Credit Suisse last week, which went through and analysed the data and the reasons for it. And the conclusion is very much that countries of medium-sized countries of Scotland's size, up to 10 million kind of size, do better. They're more coherent, they're more focused, they're more able to take advantage of opportunity, they're more able to deal with risk, they're more efficient public services because they've got such big bureaucracies to try and manage a big service across a big country. So despite what you would have you tell, bigger isn't better in economic terms. Medium-sized, Scotland's a medium-sized country, is very much where you want to be. The countries on there, of course, that aren't in that category, the USA, Australia, Canada, the thing that they've got in common, of course, is that they used to be ruled from Westminster, and you don't see them queuing up to come back under London control anytime soon. Independence has been just fine for them. So the way I look at it is that's what Scotland should be. We should be in that club. We should be right up at the top of that list. Because, as I say, apart from Norway, none of those countries have got the advantages we've got, and the fact that we haven't is just a measure of how the Union has held Scotland back. That's your Standard & Poor's report from February this year. So you don't take my word for it. Look at what they had to say. They're the agency, one of the agencies that rates countries in terms of how creditworthy they are in international money markets. They were quite comfortable giving Scotland their highest economic assessment, even excluding the revenue from oil and gas. When I started looking at all this, you look at the numbers and they tell a story, and then you take a step back and you say, well, if Scotland's generating all this wealth, why does it not look like it? Why do you drive around parts of Scotland and it sure don't look like a rich country? And then we stumbled across a couple of charts that maybe help to explain that. The first one's a map of gross domestic product by part of the UK. Basically, the darker the colour, the more wealth is generated in that part of the UK. And what you can see is, as you'd expect, the City of London is generating a lot of wealth along the kind of Thames Valley M4 corridor. There's a lot of economic activity down at the south coast. And down the kind of Manchester area, the northwest of England, northeast of Scotland, and down across the central belt as well. That's kind of where the wealth is generated in the UK. As I say, if you look at Scotland on its own, compared to the rest of the UK, our GDP is about 15% higher than the UK average. The second map is a map of from the UK Office of National Statistics, and this is where the wealth ends up. This is their chart of where the wealthiest households in the UK are. The way they measure it, they picked a number, I don't know why they picked this number, £967,000, and they say, okay, households above that value of assets are classed as a wealthy household. That's your total assets, the value of your house, the value of your savings, your private pension, your car, your yacht, whatever, all added together, how much your wealth is in that household. So in terms of what they call wealthy households, south coast of England it's more than 13%, and it becomes less and less the further north you go in Scotland, it's less than 7%. So that kind of shows that's where the wealth is generated, and that's where it ends up. Which ties into the numbers we've seen, because what it's saying is Scotland generates a tax take, goes to Westminster, but only some of it comes back, and over the decades that's the effect of that policy. So to summarise that part of it, to tell you too poor, I write, don't believe them. I'm going to touch on a wee bit now about why you get people coming on the television and the radio every night telling us we can't afford it, it'll be a disaster, don't even dare think about becoming independent because you'll be as poor as Chuck Norris, etc. And part of the reason, of course, is I'm afraid to say self-interest. If you're a member of Parliament, well, people ask me how many people are going to lose their jobs if they become independent, and I say, well, the answer's easy, it's 59, it's the number of MPs that Scotland sends to Westminster. And if you've worked your way up the greasy pole and got yourself a safe seat, and then you're there for the rest of your career, maybe a house and that seat in the House of Lords, if you play your cards right, then it's difficult to get expense account and everything. And then this independence malarkey comes along and you can see a nice week in your strength, and sure you're going to see what you need to say to try and maintain things just as they are. And I was actually talking to somebody last night, and they said they were at a meeting where there was a Labour MP who was debating on the other side, and they said, you know, his heart wasn't in it, and they spoke to him afterwards. And you could tell just by looking at him, he didn't believe what he was saying. But the guy is an MP, and he's worried he's going to lose his job, and that's the bottom line. So he's trotting out all the lines, because that's what he has to do. And there's a wee nice wee quote that kind of summarises that. It's hard to get somebody to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. Okay. I'm going to touch very briefly on scare stories, because that's what again had thrown at us for the last 2-3 years now, constantly. I just want to pick on a couple of them. I could talk all night on them, because there's dozens of them, and they're all being debunked. But I'll just pick on a couple to give a couple of examples. This is from the Daily Express of February 1979. Back in just about around 1979. Some of you remember it very well. Others, like the young man at the back who was 18 yesterday, will have no idea what I'm talking about. 1979, of course, we had the first referendum about the Scottish Assembly, and the vote was won, but the Assembly was never set up for various reasons, as we know. But the scare stories go right back to then, and the Daily Express, the month before the vote, in its editorial, listed all the horrible things that would happen to Scotland if we dared to vote for our own Assembly. And of course that's a list, a roll call of Scotland's industrial heritage, and a sad ironic thing, of course, is no Assembly was set up, and all of that we got a faction instead, and then all of those sites were shut down over the following decade. Learn from history. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. This is the third time I'm asking listener to be fooled this time. And talking about companies, talking about relocating, Standard Life and Scottish Widows both on record in the 1990s as saying they would move out of Scotland if in the 1997 referendum we voted for a Scottish Parliament. So again, we've got a Scottish Parliament and we've still got Standard Life and Scottish Widows here, so we'll take this stuff with a large pinch of salt. The next I'm going to talk about is pensions, which is something that the no company have shamelessly pursued through Project Fear. This is a headline from the Daily Telegraph at the end of last year. There was a study of OECD countries, industrialised countries, 40 countries, and they looked at the state pension in terms of how much it'll buy, the cost of living. And of the 40 countries, the UK was number 39, Mexico was number 40. So the no company is getting cheap to talk about you'll lose this wonderful UK pension if you state pension if you vote for independence, because the sad reality is the UK state pension is a bit of a disgrace. Another point, of course, is that it's the numbers, some more numbers for you. Scotland's much better able to afford the state pension than the rest of the UK is. Social protection, which is pensions plus welfare spend in Scotland, is a lower percentage of our tax revenue, it's a lower percentage of our total economy. So if Scotland can't afford pensions, the rest of the UK sure can't afford them. And not like that, I mean, this is a letter that was sent from the Department of Work and Pensions to somebody that wrote to them very recently asking what would happen if Scotland became independent. And of course the reality is if you've paid into the UK system, the UK government owes you the pension, regardless of whether you live in Spain, France, Italy or Scotland. It doesn't make any difference. And they're on record as having said that. So I'm going to finish up with a wee bit about the opportunities we've maybe got as an independent country. I think we've shown that we can do it financially, we're more than capable of it. Debunk some of the scare stories that are thrown against us, and this is a wee bit of a look to the future, the vision, what it could look like. And it's a wee story about the Prime Minister of Norway who goes for a walk along the fjord one day, and he stumbles across the magic lamp, and he picks up and gives it a rub, and the genie pops out as he does, and says to the Prime Minister of Norway, "I'll give you some wishes to make Norway a better country." And the Prime Minister of Norway says, "Well, that's difficult to think of anything. We're just about the richest country in the world. They measure these things and tell us we're one of the happiest countries in the world. There's very little poverty to speak of. Most folk have got good enough jobs and leisure time to enjoy it." And the genie says, "Well, you'll need to think of something." So the Prime Minister thinks for a minute and then says, "Well, I can think of a few things." He says, "Okay." He said, "First thing we've got is our economy in Norway. We've been done very well, but our economy is quite narrow. We've got an oil industry, we've got fisheries, we've not got much else. It'd be great if we had another industry we could rely on into the future. For example, we've got this national drink called aquavit we love it, but nobody else has heard of it. It'd be great if that was a global brand and everybody from Singapore to Chicago would pay stupid money to take off our hands, and we were the only people that could make this stuff, and we couldn't make enough of it. That'd be a nice way industry to have. He says, yeah, we can do that for you. He said, we've got a problem with the language, you speak Norwegian, but nobody else in the world speaks Norwegian. If you want to go on holiday or go and do business with somebody else, we will learn another language. It'd be great if you could just make Norwegian the little business language so that everybody spoke it, and we got off the plane in Japan or Brazil to do business, we started speaking Norwegian and everybody knew what we were talking about. That would make life a bit easier. I said, yeah, we can do that for you. He said, we've got a great country in Norway, it's beautiful, but it's a long way from north to south, mountains all over the place, the weather's atrocious, in the winter it's -35, which is not to hear about the snow plows out for 3 months of the year, just getting to work's hard work. He said it'd be great if you could just give us the same natural resources and the same population in a country a quarter the size, infrastructure a lot easier and a lot cheaper, and give us a nice mild winter so we don't have to worry about getting the snow plows out to get to work in the morning. So yeah, we can do that for you. He said we've got no problem to export to our main markets in Europe. We've got to go through 2 other countries to get to our main markets. It'd be great if you just bought a landmass of 60 million people on our southern border, so we could just nip over the border to sell them stuff. And they wanted to buy a drink, oil, our energy, and our fisheries, etc. That would be nice and easy. And of course, you'd make them all speak Norwegian, so we could talk to them. And we wouldn't want to do a rule by them, understand just what happened was a friend or neighbour for doing business with. That would make life a wee bit easier. He said it'd be great if we had 4 of the top 100 universities in the world in Norway. That would help with research and development. It'd be great for an industrial heritage going back 200 years. And people around the world wanted to do business with us for all the great things we've invented. And it'd be great for that diaspora of tens of millions of people that came around one of the world's biggest economies that could trace their ancestry back to Norway and wanted to help us succeed in the world. And it'd be great with a stronger national brand so people knew who we were in Norway and came here on holiday. If our national poet was celebrated every year in Moscow and Washington and with the national press, everybody instantly recognised, that would make life a bit easier. And the point is, of course, that the No campaign kind of laughed at us and talked about one day we could be as rich as Norway. In 1970, Norway was poorer than Scotland. It had been there a couple of cards, played them very well. Coherent democracy, 5 million people, all focused on what's important for Norway. But we actually sit with a blank bit of paper and listed all the things that you want an ideal country to be in the 21st century in terms of size, location, language, history, natural resources, human resources, education system, heritage, brand, the whole lot. You come up with something that looks pretty much like Scotland. It's hard to beat it actually. The only bit that's missing to build something particularly special here with a bit of hard work over the coming years is to get the yes vote in September, and then we'll go from there. So look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ivan. We will, if you don't mind, save questions after all 3 of our speakers have spoken. Next up we have Marsha Scott. Marsha is Dr. Marsha Scott. Apologies, Marsha. Manages local authority early intervention programs and is a researcher, consultant and campaigner for women's rights. She's a UK expert on the European Observatory on Violence Against Women, a member of the Scottish Women's Budget Group and the chair of Engender, which is Scotland's national feminist organisation. She speaks in a personal capacity tonight. Marsha.
Hello, thank you for that. I'm always pleased when people clap at the beginning just in case it doesn't happen. I've been asked to speak for 10 minutes, which is a bit of a challenge for someone who can barely say her name in 5 minutes. So,
have as long as you want, Marsha.
So I've decided to spare you most of this and just to focus on a couple of things. In part because the 18th of September is feeling very close, and those of us who've been campaigning for a while, I think, are spending a lot of time thinking about what are the critical things that we can do in the next few weeks that might actually make a difference. And when you're speaking to an audience that you know is predisposed to yes, I think my inclination at the moment, and this is the first time I've done this, is to try and give you arguments to then ask you to take to your undecided friends. So that's mostly what I'm going to focus on tonight. My journey to Yes started in New York. I know that's going to come as a big surprise because I sound so Scottish. I was born and grew up in New York City, and I'm the proud daughter of a single mother, daughter of a single mother, daughter of a single mother. And I know you're saying, well, I don't want my son marrying into that family. And there was a bit of death involved. My grandfather died in 1901, and my great-grandfather had a heart attack early, as did my father. But you'll be happy to know that it was divorce because my singlehood and my ex-husband, I wouldn't say he's exactly thriving, but he's definitely alive. And the reason that I mention all of that is because it sort of frames the issues for me that are the most important about the independence question for us. And somewhat explains why I got involved in the campaign. So I came to Scotland in 2000, and I moved into Edinburgh, and I fell in love with the country and with the fact that I could live in a place where the F word wasn't feminist and and socialist wasn't the S word, and you could be left wing and have lots of company. And I stayed, and I found great work and great friends, and I was welcomed into the body of the Kirk by feminists who were just really glad that somebody else was willing to pick up some of the tasks that we all had. So I came, and then the independence referendum began to emerge, and I thought to myself, gosh, what do I think about that? And so I thought, well, my inclination was to say, well, anybody should have independence. Is that really in anybody else's ears, or is it just my hearing aid? I'll stand back here and see if that helps. And I went to hear Gordon Brown speak in Fife. There was I have a young friend who used to work for me who was involved in labor politics in Fife. And so he got me an invite to a breakfast, invite only. This was probably about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And I had always had a sneaking affection, not that I never met him, for Gordon Brown, because I was quite excited when he became Prime Minister. I thought maybe then some of the values that I was seeing all around me in Scotland were going to begin to be evident in the new Labour. That was a big fail. But so I went, but I thought maybe it wasn't his fault. So I went to hear Gordon Brown, and he started out with about 10 minutes of football jokes, which both culturally and gender-wise went completely over my head. But did really give me a message about who it was that Gordon was talking to. Because he wasn't talking to me. He wasn't talking to people who don't care about football. He wasn't talking to people who care about things that are not about winning a fight between your political party and another political party. So I came away thinking, yeah, I think maybe my instinct for yes is right, but I'll check it out and I'll start listening to the panels and the debates. And I was struck by the fact that the conversations that were happening in my life, around my dinner table, at the pub with my friends, were filled with women. You know, they weren't exclusively women, but they were filled with women who were insightful and excited and interested and critical about the arguments that were being made. But there was very, very little evidence of women on the platforms from either side, and certainly in the arguments that were being made in terms of whose interests were being met and would be met by an independent Scotland, which is what brought me to get in touch with Women for Independence and say, we have to do something about this. This is awful. As a single mother, what are the issues that I care about? Do I care about currency? Well, as Irvin Welsh said, the only thing I care about currency is whose pocket it winds up in, to be honest. And let me tell you, that does not tend to be women's pockets in Scotland. we're paying 74% of the price tag for austerity in the UK. And 85% of the tax reform benefits are going to men. If we look at the question of equal pay, the current estimate of when equal pay will actually be delivered, despite the fact that it's been the law of the land for 40 years, it's now gotten pushed back a little bit, given the failed austerity agenda. So it's 2074. Now, I do plan to live long, but I am not going to make it to equal pay, and that's just not good enough. 1 in 4 children in Scotland live in poverty. Child's poverty is really women's poverty. 97% of the households, single-parent households on benefit in Scotland are headed by women. And until and unless we begin to get serious about gender gaps, about the women's poverty, about the fact that childcare, we have some of the most expensive and least accessible childcare in all of Europe, we will not take our children out of poverty. We will not create a just Scotland. So, in terms of what I would invite you to do, especially if your undecided friends are women, I would suggest that you point out that there are only 2 certainties at the moment for us. And while I absolutely have confidence in the figures that we've just heard, I know that a lot of my undecided friends are saying, yes, but we'll hear this, and then we'll hear somebody else say, oh no, those figures are wrong. And this is just an example of what's come through my post box in the last month. I suspect you've had some similar kinds of things, some of them from the UK government, although remarkably that doesn't seem to include the Scottish government. Some of them from the Yes campaign. They're from very diverse and making very diverse and contrary arguments. So I think there are 2 things that are absolutely certain. And the first one is that if we vote yes, we'll have more democracy. Or to steal sort of the campaign line from Bill Clinton's campaign, that was their line was, it's about the economy stupid, but my line is, it's about the democracy stupid. If we don't know anything else, we know that a yes vote will bring more democracy to Scotland. It doesn't mean we'll make better decisions, although I hope we will. It does mean that we'll then be held accountable for our decisions, and it does mean that the people we vote in, we can vote out. The second certainty is that if we don't vote yes, is that my buzzer?
No, it wasn't.
It's like
the second certainty is that if we vote no, we will have Trident. We will have Trident for a long time. We will have Europe's largest store of nuclear weapons 30 miles from our biggest city. Those 2 are both deal breakers for me, and I hope they will be for your undecided friends. And lots more to talk about childcare, about occupational segregation, about the fact that the UK is the number 6 largest seller of small and large arms in the world, and that those arms are often used overseas to assault and kill women and children, and poor women and children and poor men for the most part. But I will instead save that for the question period and just finish with an open letter to women that I've put copies on the back table for. This was written by myself and 2 other women, Leslie Orr and Nell Whiting, in order to try and reach out to our sisters who are undecided. So it will go like this, and I apologize for reading, but I'm not so good on the memorizing. Should Scotland be an independent country? This question invites us to imagine a new future, one that just might transform the lives of women and girls. But as 18 September approaches, we must not allow the sheer breadth of our vision to obscure the stark consequences of a no vote. For those still on the fence, let us be very, very clear. A no vote is not a vote for the status quo. Let us remind ourselves about the easy nature of political promises, promises that previously have been unkept, and the importance of relying on ourselves to make change, rather than hoping others will do it for us. Let us think calmly about the likelihood of a women's agenda progressing in any Westminster government of the near future. And if you believe that that will happen, I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. And let us imagine the costs we are already paying for austerity, multiplied many times by a Westminster whose power would be unchecked by the possibility of a yes vote. We think you should vote yes on 18 September, not because we think independence will guarantee gender justice, but because our four sisters and your four sisters organized and argued, campaigned and cared for their families, risked and rebelled to ensure that Scotland has used its devolved powers to make Scotland a better nation for women. We think you should vote yes on the 18th of September because, standing on their shoulders, we can imagine a Scotland that embraces the politics of dignity, of justice, of care, in which all participate, animated by a spirit of equality and liberation for us all. Feminists have long advocated for different approaches to those taken by successive Westminster governments, to the economy, to international development, to human rights, to immigration and asylum, to international relations, to abortion and reproductive rights, to employment and the labor market, to access to justice, to nuclear weapons, to anti-discrimination law. Independence will bring decision-making on these critical issues to Scottish women, or closer to Scottish women. Independence will bring opportunities for the voices of Scottish women to resound in the places of decision-making. We vote yes with hope rooted in the courage and resilience of Scotland's women. We vote yes with determination to bring forth a better nation.
Feedback. You meant to move it a bit forward with that. It must be in line with the speakers. It's not in your area. You're not going crazy.
You're this way.
Move it like 2 feet forward. That should be fine.
Okay.
I think so.
Sounds better to me.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. A bit too close to Marshall, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Marsha. Our third speaker is Andy Myles. Now, Andy is a lifelong Liberal activist, was the party's chief executive for 5 years, a key Lib Dem negotiator in drawing up the constitutional convention that led to the Holyrood Parliament, and served as special advisor to the Lib Dem leader in the second Parliament. To tell us why he's now voting yes, Andy Myles.
Thank you. The first thing that I've got to say to you is that last year I quietly left the Liberal Democrats. I wasn't very happy at the things being done in Westminster in my name. So I stopped paying the money, and I now describe myself as a recovering politician. But tonight we're all coming to the end of many, many months of intense campaigning and debate and discussion. And I watched the televised debate last night, and I've been watching, as I always do, the newspapers and radio and television. And trying to sum up where we've got to at the end of this period. And, you know, the thing is that I've always been in politics to try and make a better country, a better community, a better society for the people I live with, for my family and my friends, my neighbours and everybody else. And the Yes campaign has, from very early on, been about trying to make a better Scotland. And it's brought out a lot of people who are not in the SNP, they're not nationalists, but they've got ideas about how we can make this a better place, how we can look after one another, how we can interact with the rest of the world, how we can be a good, ordinary country and improve things. And one of the things that I wanted to say this evening is, I find it really very, very sad, but when I look at the No campaign, and when I listened to Alistair Darling yesterday, I tried to find some nod, some essence, some little bit about making things better. And you know the truth? There was nothing there. He had nothing to say about how the No campaign wanted to make this a better society, a better community, a better neighbourhood. It was all negative. It was all about how the other side were wrong. And I find that very sad, and a sad reflection on the United Kingdom. Equipment hates
Thanks, Peter. This is the rap interlude.
Getting faster. Alice is up the
Do you want to try it without the microphone?
Yeah. Go for it.
Just talk louder.
On the day that I was born, God was only handing out flutes. Usually he's got a supply of trombones. And I got this story entirely the wrong way. He didn't have any flutes left. He only had trombones left. So you should be able to hear me, I hope. Yeah, what I was saying was I couldn't find anything positive at all in the yes case, in the no case. It really has been terribly negative, and I find that very, very sad, because I have spent a lifetime as a Liberal Democrat trying to make the UK a better place. I tried very hard to help create a Scottish Parliament, and I'm very proud of playing a part in that. I've tried also to reform the House of Lords. No success. It's still appointed. I've tried to get a fair electoral system for the House of Commons. No success. It's still elected by first past the post, and you still have a government which represents about 40% of the people. I've tried reforming a whole series of aspects of its economy and tried to campaign against this manic desire to turn the world over to be the plaything of giant corporations. I haven't had a great deal of success there at all. And I've come to the conclusion that I may be a recovering politician, and I may also be a bit of a failed politician. But I have tried, and looking at it closely in my career over 30 years in politics, I've come to the conclusion that actually the UK is an extraordinarily difficult country to reform. It doesn't even have a constitution that you can pin down and amend. There is no process for amendment of it. There's a lot of medieval higgledy-piggledy nonsense in there. You can't pin it down, you can't reform it, and you can't change it. And that's one of the reasons why I've decided, let's cut the Gordian knot, let's just do it ourselves. We're an ancient nation, we did it once upon a time for 700 years in the Kingdom of Scots, we can do it again. There's no reason to say that the path into the future has got to be inside the United Kingdom. The path into the future can be us as the community of Scotland doing it again for ourselves if we want to bring the power back. And I've listened to the arguments. I've listened to the arguments particularly from my ex-colleagues in the Liberal Democrats. And I'm afraid, the arguments which I have as a Liberal are all about bringing power back down closer to people and making sure that it doesn't stop as we bring it back to Edinburgh, that it comes down here to Peebles and it goes to Stornoway and Kirkwall and the islands. I haven't heard any of that. All I've heard from Liberal Democrats, I'm afraid, is that we're stronger and bigger together. And I have a challenge for them. Since when was bigness a Liberal virtue? Since when was strength a Liberal virtue? I don't want to live in a country, in the EU that's at the top table and one of the big players that swings the others. That sounds to me like having more power than your fair share. I only want our fair share of power. And it becomes even clearer when you see it in relation to the United Nations. Britain has one of the 5 vetoes, the 5 veto votes on the Security Council, because we used to be an empire, but we still cling on to this power. We're still building the biggest ships that the Royal Navy has ever had so that we'll have global military reach. I don't want to live in a country with global military reach. I don't want to live in imperial power that tries to police the rest of the world. I wish that the UK would grow up and break out of this nonsense, because it's long, long gone that we had the empire. We don't need that vote. Let's give it to somebody who deserves it, like Brazil or India. Let's let India represent the British Commonwealth of Nations in the Security Council. Let's move on from the idea that the UK is this great power in the world, because frankly, we're not. Just take the aircraft carriers. We can't afford them in the first place. They're costing billions. The one that's already on the 4th doesn't actually have any planes for the next 5 years, and the second one is very probably never going to be commissioned by the Royal Air Force because we simply can't afford to run it. Who are we fooling that we're a great power? I want to live in a country which is, by comparison, completely ordinary, but a country that's got extraordinary people, the way that I think in Scotland that we have. People who produce ideas. People who have produced ideas that change the world. So I want to live in an ordinary country which lives in some ordinary, basic, decent constitutional bases as well. Not the idea that there's a magic box under the Speaker's chair in the House of Commons that gives them absolute sovereignty in the Crown in Parliament. I want, as a Liberal, the recognition that the sovereignty rests with the people. All of us. We all have sovereignty. And we pass that power upwards to make decisions. The closer it is to us, the better chance we've got of being able to scrutinise the politicians and the businessmen and the other people who are exercising power. So we shouldn't be passing that power too far up. As a Liberal, I have an abomination of the accumulation of power. Because when power starts accumulating in centres, it becomes less and less likely to be scrutinised and held to account. And you end up with all sorts of tyranny. And there's far too much of that in the world at the present moment. There's far too much power being accumulated in giant corporations. There's far too much power being accumulated, power and wealth in the tax havens and in the London elite. And half of those tax havens, in fact 2/3 of those tax havens, are of course still part of the British Empire. What are these aircraft carriers for? Partly, very largely, to defend our tax havens, the sandbanks and rocks on which $73 trillion of our common wealth is currently sitting doing absolutely nothing to solve climate change or poverty or the huge issues which actually affect our world, the really important issues which we should be tackling. It's sitting there in British tax havens, and our government has quietly done it. And are they going to reform it? Are they going to change it? Are they going to take this blot away from what's being done in my name and your name? No, they're not even talking about it. We've sleptwalked into this as a United Kingdom. So, I want to live in an ordinary country with extraordinary people, and I don't want to live in an empire. And I want to live in a country which has fundamental, and I will argue for them whichever country I happen to live in on the 19th of September, fundamental liberal values. I want to balance the fundamental values of liberty and equality and community. I want to live in a fair, free and open society. I want to fight poverty and ignorance and conformity and accumulations of power. And will continue to do so regardless of the result. But I have quite a lot of experience in UK politics and Scottish politics. And the last 15 years since we re-established our own parliament in Scotland, I think we've actually shown that we can do things our way. That our way is different not alien, not completely different. But I think we can make this a good country, and that's why I'm going to vote yes, because I think we can make this a better country, and we've got a much better chance of making a better country to live in than if we stay in the United Kingdom, because the problems there are too great. It won't reform. I've tried desperately hard to reform it, and it just seems to be impossible to reform. And my own party went into the Westminster government. Did they get PR, fair voting system? No. Did they get the House of Lords? Oh yes, they got promised the House of Lords, and then the Tories turned around and said, actually, we changed our mind, you can't have that. So did they leave government? No, they didn't. And we've still got a House of Lords that's completely appointed. We live in a country which is only, it has the vestiges of democracy in the UK. I want to live in a real democracy with a written constitution. Together, I believe that we can make this a better place. We can make a better place for Scots, but we can also make it a better place where we share what we have and our ideas and our values with the rest of the world. I beg you to vote yes.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is where we would like to open it up to the floor and invite any questions, if anyone would like to pose them to our panel.
I've got one question that I would just like one direct answer to, because I'm tired of the obfuscation and rhetoric I've heard tonight as well.
Okay.
And that is, if the yes vote wins, will you guarantee that we'll go back to a 100% national health service? Because Alex Salmon didn't answer that last night, and nobody's given me that. You tell me yes to that, and I'll give you yes in a fortnight's time.
Okay.
Without any obfuscation, I want a direct answer.
I'll try and give you a direct answer. The NHS in Scotland is separate from the NHS in England. One was passed in 1947 and the other in 1948. So they were started separately. And I worked for 9 years as an NHS manager in mental health services in Dundee. I know quite a bit about the differences between the services south and north of the border. Since we established devolution, they have diverged really hugely. Because in Scotland, we have not gone down the path of privatising.
Yes, you are. That's my point.
Okay, what path have we gone down?
They are putting more and more people into private hospitals for treatment because they're not coping with them in the NHS. Sometimes at a cost of £3,500 a week at least.
They spent 70 million last year on private health services to deal with waiting lists. That's the major feature. What's happening in England is that figure is multiplied way greater. And they've put this marketing which allows health boards to actually stop providing the services but actually paying into the private sector, which is not allowed in Scotland. There are other aspects of the privatisation that's going on in England that is not going here. And don't take my word for it. Take the British Medical Association or the Royal College of Nursing. Because when Nicola Sturgeon was the Health Secretary in Scotland, she got standing ovations at both. Because we are keeping the NHS the way it is. Now, there are no guarantees after September the 19th, but I can tell you that the policy of the Scottish Labour Party, the Scottish National Party, and the Scottish Liberal Democrats is not to go down the path south of the border that is being followed and has been passed into law by the current coalition government. So I'm not going to give guarantees because there are risks in going into the future on any path you choose. But I'm absolutely convinced that the NHS as we know it is going to survive here much better if this is an independent country. And I believe that we have proved that since we re-established our own parliament in 1999.
Could I just answer that one
government, the biggest provider of healthcare is Virgin. The people who provide the trains and provide our mobile phones are the second biggest provider of healthcare. They have gone so far down the route of privatisation, which makes them open to all kinds of international trade deals, which will make it very possible and very likely that American and European companies will bid more and more to provide health services. Completely fragmented, and that is absolutely not the way we want to go in Scotland.
Because there is a pattern that has emerged from the Westminster government of selling off public services to huge corporates. Virgin is a perfect example of a corporate that is still growing, and it doesn't matter which area it wants to go into, it will make money out of it. And the public wealth, the common wealth, our wealth, is sucked out and ends up in a tax haven. I agree entirely.
It's exactly the same in Scotland.
Sorry?
I'm just comment on that. My number. I mean, I saw some of the numbers on this last week, and that this issue was kicking about. I mean, the number is 70 million, which is what I believe the Scottish government is spending on private in Scotland. The focus to bring waiting lists down, as I understand it, is about 0.6% of the 12 billion spent in Scotland. The spend on private south of the border is about 10 billion, which is about 12 times on a pro rata basis. So it's about 8% of what they're spending, and that number's also increasing. So in Scotland there is, but it's a very, very small percentage. Down south it's a big number, and it's getting bigger all the time.
Yeah, I also think there's a fundamental difference between using private services to reduce waiting lists and actually saying we're going to contract out for how we deliver our services.
Yeah.
They're two completely different things. Sorry, I'm going to go to the chap at the back first.
Yeah, I guess vote on the 18th doesn't mean to say will be independent on the 19th. There'll be entering into a period of negotiation and discussion. Is this going to go easily or well or what? Is it going to be barriers set up which is going to make it very, very difficult? Will we actually end up with independence, or could it be something not
okay?
Thank
you.
Well, I wish I had a crystal ball, and as you will have known when you asked the question, obviously nobody has an answer for that. It would be very hard to imagine that it will be easy, because there are vested interests very much on the side of reducing our independence to as narrow a definition as possible. One of the suggestions that I have been making in terms of trying to imagine how that negotiation process could reflect the values of a broader Scotland than what is like what would have possibly been the suits that would have originally been identified. And Nicola Sturgeon has made a public commitment to making sure that the negotiating committee is 50% women. Why does that matter? Women are not automatically better at anything. They're not automatically more humane. They're not, or as Robin Morgan says, the only thing that women are automatically is human. But I think that part of our commitment to making that negotiation process reflect the values and the reasons that we've all done this campaign has been that we need to make sure that it's not the usual suspects who are deciding what the priorities are for it. So for me, priority will be, that we maintain a process that allows us enough investment, that allows us to invest in a publicly provided childcare, for instance, or a variety of things that women will bring to the table. They won't necessarily be, and they will bring a different negotiating strategy. So I think we need to make sure that in our name, the negotiations happen with folks who are as diverse as Scotland is, and as committed to a broader agenda than just power in Edinburgh.
Okay, thanks, Marsha. Yeah, I just comment on the negotiations. I think you're absolutely right. I think that kind of, which to some extent where the Constitution ends up and
Yes.
policy and stuff. In terms of the negotiations with the rest of the UK, it's quite interesting. There was a guy that I met through this campaign is retired now, but he spent his life in negotiations in business and training people in business how to negotiate. And it was fascinating talking to him about what's going on, because the reality is the negotiations already started. Right? The most obvious example of that's all this stuff about the currency. What that is people laying out signals as to what they will and what they won't accept, where the red lines are, what's possible, what isn't possible. So we actually get behind the stuff up front. The meaning of those words in a very subtle way is kind of laying out what their positions are. Scotland, to some extent, has got some fairly strong cards, right? The rest of the UK has got some, I think Scotland's got some stronger ones, and I'll go through those in a minute. But the reality is that it's in the interest of everybody to make it as painless as possible. Because from the UK's point of view, despite what we think about it, their position as a world power is very, very important to them. And a big part of brand Britain, if you like, around the world is fair, reasonable, democratic, rule of law. That's a huge part of what they're seen to be all about. So the fact they've signed the Edinburgh Agreement is very important. It's made the whole process constitutional and accept the result, etc. And then within the Edinburgh Agreement, both parties working towards delivering the final outcome after the vote is to the benefit of both sides. So the UK government will not want to be seen to be difficult, obstreperous, going against the will of the people in the referendum. They'll also not want to split the markets, which is fundamentally important as well, because the markets hate uncertainty. They had to come out in January and make a commitment to the markets that they've underwritten all of the debt, because the markets were starting to ask questions about, well, if it's a yes, well, what happens to all the money he owns, who owns us at then? So they had to come out and nail that down and make it very clear that still the borrowing costs going up at that point in time. So they won't want to split the markets either. And they'll want to be working in the international organisations that are there and make the whole thing as smooth and as seamless as possible. Without knowing exactly what's going on, there's in terms of the UK side, Scotland will want the rest of the UK to make an entry into EU and NATO fairly seamless and fairly uneventful. It's interesting the UK to do that. In fact, the UK goes to Brussels and says we're quite comfortable with all of this, then it'll be an absolute sure. And that's fairly important. On Scotland's side, there's the issue of the debt. The UK's underwritten it, but the UK can't afford to take it all. So they are very keen that Scotland takes it. On the UK side, there's all issue of the currency union. Scotland can use the pound anyway, but a currency union makes most sense for everybody, so there'll be an understanding around about that. They'll come out with a form of words, and they'll know this better than me, but I'm sure they'll come out with a form of words that allows everybody to pretend that they haven't had a currency union, but it will be a de facto currency union. So as a politician, you can get an arrangement for the facilitation of the use of sterling across the island, and other right. So, and then the big one, the other one, the biggest one of the lot, don't underestimate it, of course, is Trident, because that's probably the ace card that the Scottish Government will hold. And the arrangement around about the timing of that and the process whereby it moves, etc., is a fairly strong negotiating card, because you could see that getting that junk metal off my land on 2016. At one extreme, they've given a backstop of 2020 and 2021, and there'll be discussion around about that. So you lay that on the table, both sides have got fairly strong cards, they're both kind of chained together in the lifeboat. Nobody's going to throw the other one overboard, so it doesn't make any sense, and they'll both work it through fairly quickly. That, to be fair, is it. There's a limited number of big issues. There's a whole bunch of stuff about how do you divide up the whatever, how do you want DVLA, what do you do with BBC, but frankly a lot of that stuff is fairly straightforward and doesn't need to be defined or finalised by the point of independence, right? I don't know the detail, but if you took DVLA for example, if we continue to pay DVLA a fee every year for a few years while we sorted out a system that allowed us to do whatever, they'd be delighted because they're getting a revenue stream, and frankly, in practical purposes, it makes no difference. And I don't know if that's going to be the end solution, but you look through all the agencies, there's still a commonality. Both sides are interested. The UK will be interested to continue to get the revenue stream from Scotland to fund those departments, because if they lose on day one, they've got a funding issue. And as I say, both sides will want to make it as smooth as possible. So I don't know if that, and I'm sure Andy's done this stuff for real.
Well, I've negotiated inside the Constitutional Convention, sparring with Jack McConnell and George Robertson for 5 years, And I was also on the negotiating teams in 1999 and 2003 that negotiated the partnership agreements between the Liberal Democrats and Labour. So I do have a little bit of experience in terms of negotiation. A lot of that involved negotiating with London, because the London end of the parties had to be, in the case of the Liberal Democrats, told to keep their noses out of it. I think in the Labour Party the negotiations may be slightly different, because Gordon Brown was pulling the strings in London. But I would actually point to the fact that we've seen already in the run-up to the referendum 2 very different negotiating styles. Negotiating style that's developed in Scotland, where politics, because of PR, has become very much a politics of negotiation, where you only expect to get the say that you get from your own share of the votes, and that you've actually got to talk to other people and form governments and reach agreements. Whereas what we're seeing from the Better Together campaign is the kind of debating which I tend to associate with the sixth form debating clubs in the public schools I was sent to by my parents, and which most of them in the Westminster establishment went to. And you've got this, oh, well, we're not going to let you join the EU, and we're not going to let you have the pound, and we're not going to let you have this, that, and the next thing. And I really find it very, very juvenile. But I would predict that that will disappear the minute the people of Scotland have exerted their sovereign will at the ballot box. Because, as Ivan says, it's not in their interests to make a complete ass of these negotiations. These negotiations would be talking seriously about billions and billions of pounds as we diverge in our paths as 2 different branches of democracy into the future. And I wouldn't worry about reflecting on the style that we've seen before the vote, because I don't think that it's going to be replicated exactly afterwards. But one other comment. I don't think any of us should get too het up about the idea of being independent as something that's terribly, terribly much of a leap of faith. Actually, we will still be dependent. We will still be dependent, for example, on the royal family to produce our monarch. We will be dependent on our relationship with the EU. We will be dependent on the international community of nations, the United Nations. I watched the 73 nations and territories and the ragbag of the Commonwealth coming into the Commonwealth Games, and it was very, very interesting, because you've got, at one end of the spectrum, you've got Norfolk Island, which has 2,000 people, and is wholly dependent for transport, food, and virtually everything else on New Zealand. And at the other end, you've got Mozambique, which was never actually in the British Empire, and it doesn't have a relationship with the Crown. It's never been a Crown dependency. And in between, you've got nations like Canada and New Zealand and Australia, which are still dependent for Her Majesty the Queen to provide heirs so that they can have a head of state. And then you go back along the levels of dependency, and actually it's a spectrum. It's not, these are all not dependent, and these ones are independent. What we're actually doing, I think, if we vote yes, is moving along the path towards greater independence and taking our own decisions a little bit faster than we are in any case. And it is not something that we should be afraid of. We have the skills and the talents in the people of Scotland to be able to get there and to make the decisions that we want to make. Thank you.
Can I add to that thing that I think maybe what we're moving towards is interdependence.
Yes.
No, which is
Yes.
dependence is independence and it's interdependence, which I think suggesting is very important. But the trying question, which I agree, Marsha, is a major, major, major issue for everybody, possibly particularly for women, but for everybody. And in the debate last night, it came up, and somebody in the audience asked about jobs, which obviously is a major issue for everybody as well. I'm interested in how Ivan would respond to that question. We're going to use 5,000 jobs. We can't do that. We need Trident.
Well, the numbers are about 560, I think, is the number of jobs that depend on Trident. The other jobs that are running the base, right? So it's guys that are doing stuff to do with the base, whatever it happens to be like.
Highly technical term.
Yeah, well, I mean, closing the gate or making tea in the canteen or whatever, right through to guys that are doing technical stuff on the jetties and whatever. We did a meeting out in Helmsburg 2 or 3 months back, and there was a guy came to a meeting like this, and the question said, well, how up there? What would me? So we kind of quizzed the guy what he did and figured out that he was doing something with a jetty, which you're going to need anyway if you're having. And if it's going to be the base for the Scottish Defence Force, and there's a whole thing about the Navy needs to be, the Scottish Navy needs to be much more substantial than the Royal Navy's current presence in Scotland. I mean, there's an example twice of the Russian aircraft carriers that sailed into the north of Scotland. It took them 2 days to get somebody from Portsmouth to come and see what they were up to. And clearly that is a gap, and Scotland isn't well defended in naval terms at the moment. So there will be that base, there will be jobs there, and top class. If you actually look at the defence plans for the Scottish Defence Force, there's a recruitment requirement. They're going to take up to 20,000 personnel, and they're not there. They're all away from that just now. So there's actually going to be an increase in deployment in the Defence Force over the years, and that will be tailored. I don't think Alex has explained it very well, because what's going to happen is they're going to be increasing that number. They're going to be decreasing the Trident number as it comes out over the coming years, and they'll kind of overlap and cancel each other out. So if anything, I'll end up with more people. And the numbers will be very surprised at any point it dips below what it is at the moment. But the other way to look at it is in terms of at the end of the day, it's public money. It's all public money, right? Public money we spend it on Trident, on the Defence Force, on whatever, right? And as you actually sit down and look at it and say that if I want to create jobs, the jobs only exist because I've put public money in to pay the wages, right? And if you look at the most efficient way to do that, if you had whatever £10 billion to spend on creating jobs, creating 500 jobs in Faslane isn't a very efficient use of that. Whatever the number is, X billion pounds, right? The number, there was a calculation done that was put a few weeks ago, which was instead of that you could have X thousand nurses or X thousand doctors or X thousand teachers or whatever as a comparison. You weren't spending the money on Trident, which is our public sector spend, but it's a lot more efficient because if you look at Trident, the vast majority of that's capital that goes straight to the US companies that supply the hardware. Only a very small part of it's actual wages. But if you're spending health service or education, the vast bulk of that spend actually goes into people's wages. So
the argument about this last night was actually quite disgraceful, in my opinion. You know, we're going to lose 8,000 jobs from Faslane, etc., etc. I didn't think that Alex Allen dealt with it badly, but one of the things that I would emphasise that Ivan has touched on is this. If you have £1 billion in your budget and you're a government, if you spend it on collecting waste and litter and processing it and doing something that's very low tech, you'll get a lot of jobs out of it. If you take something that's in the middle, like the health service, which is quite high tech nowadays, you'll get a lot less jobs out of £1 billion of expenditure. If you want to go to the worst possible option on public spending, spend it on nuclear. Because nuclear is the most high-tech obsession that this country, the UK, has. And it produces sod all jobs. How many people know somebody who works in nuclear waste? Anybody? One person. Thank goodness we actually have one person who does know somebody there, because 80% of the budget of the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK government, 80% of their total budget is spent on dealing with nuclear waste. And yet in this room, there's one person who knows one person who works in nuclear waste. It doesn't create jobs. The nuclear obsession, which we managed to already get out of in terms of nuclear power, applies to nuclear power creation and nuclear weapons as well. It's the worst possible way of creating jobs is to spend it on the most high-tech nonsense that we can possibly find. And I think in Scotland we can do better than that. Frankly though, we've still got to spend money on our share, if we're allowed to use the pound, after negotiations, of the £100 billion that we have so far spent on dealing with nuclear waste. Nuclear, as an environmentalist, and my day job is working in the environment movement, I don't think it's a very good idea. But in public expenditure terms, it's a disaster zone where you're just pouring good money after bad.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple of questions this time, just to try and get more people. You were next.
I just wanted to make a point about what we're doing on September the 18th. We're actually voting for independence. We're not voting for Trident, we're not voting for private healthcare or public, we're voting for independence. Once we've made that decision, if we decide yes, then we decide what we're going to do. We do not need London's permission to do anything. We do not need Brussels' permission to do anything. We negotiate as equals. And I would ask everybody to remember that we no longer need permission. We are in control.
Yes.
Basically, Callum, not a question, but 2 points. The first one is, according to Christine Graham, who is a constitutional lawyer, when the vote is made on the 18th and when they count the vote on the 18th, 19th, whenever the result comes out, assuming we have a yes vote, at that point we are independent. What happens between that point on probably the 19th and sometime in 2016 is a negotiation of what is decided on the 19th. On the 19th, we are independent. And the second point is, if you've read the Treaty of Union of 1770, which I have, the treaty set up 2 equal kingdoms. Now, there are only 2 kingdoms in Great Britain. There's England and there's Scotland. Wales is a mere principality, and Northern Ireland is nothing more than a mere province. So there are 2 kingdoms. Now, it's like a marriage. When Miss A and Mr. B get married, they form, let's say, Mr. and Mrs. C. If Miss A decides she can't be bothered with Mr. B, when she divorces Mr. B is not the rest of the C's. Is back to Mr. B. So when we talk about an independent Scotland, the rest of this island is not the rest of the United Kingdom. There is no rest of the United Kingdom. It's Iwani, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. There is no rest of the United Kingdom. Don't boost them up to think that they are a continuation of the United Kingdom. They are not.
Congratulations on reading the Treaty of Union. Also available for parties. This lady here, yes.
I would just like to say I'm a firm yes voter. I've been behind yes and independence since I was a very young woman. I would just like to ask the panel, in the god-awful event of a no vote, what do you predict for Scotland?
Okay, that's our first question. Lady behind as well.
One of the things I would like to say is that what I've enjoyed most about being part of the Yes campaign is it's a very broad church, and I look forward to the time when we get to discuss the Constitution, and hopefully we will be listened to, and that maybe we won't be dependent on the royal family to produce a queen or a king. Maybe we won't be part of the EU. hope, and I hope it is 50-50 as well. But my question, that was just a good preamble. My question really is, when we do become independent, how do the panel, or what does the panel see as Scotland's role in the world, and all these kind of areas of conflict that we're so often faced with on television? What would our role be? Because hopefully it would be very different from the kind of military, first step that the Westminster government takes.
Okay, so 2 questions this time, quite diverse. The first one, what do you see as happening if it's a no vote? What are the repercussions for Scotland? And then secondly, perhaps a more positive perspective of what could an independent Scotland do from a foreign policy perspective. Marsha, do you want to go first on this?
I suppose the reason that we wrote this open letter was because I was really frightened at the idea of a no vote, to be absolutely honest. And I'm worried that people think that it's just more of the same rather than the fact that the political landscape will have changed significantly. And I think that we're all really clear. There's lots of, been lots of stuff in the press about what might happen with the Barnett formula and what, the spend and the political cost to Scotland of having been, sort of bold enough to suggest that it might be independent. I do think, however, that there is a bigger picture, and that's a much more optimistic picture when I can put my fear away enough to look at it, and that is a result of the fact that, I have a friend from London who's been up visiting this weekend, and she said, I can't believe what's happening here in Scotland. And she said, and I go back to London, and she said, a lifelong Labour supporter, and she said, and there's nothing, it's empty, there's no political opportunities for those of us who don't agree with the current agenda. And she said, but it's so different here in Scotland, and it is different. And as many people have said in lots of different ways, the genie's not going back in the bottle. There are 50 Women for Independence branches in Scotland. None of them have any money. There are 300 and some yes branches. Democracy is flourishing in Scotland in a way that, has not happened in a very, very long time. And it will be our responsibility in the context of a no vote to protect that and to make it flourish and to find a way to independence again. And I suspect I wasn't here in the 70s when the vote happened the last time, and I can imagine how devastating that was. But we did get here again, and I think it will be about preserving the democracy that we've supported, and plotting a course that makes us a more equal and a more democratic country within the context of the powers that we have, as well as the powers that we'd like. And I know that's very theoretical, but I think it's very difficult to see what might happen, and what might happen to the sort of national psyche, because the Commonweal, radical independence, those wonderful, valiant young people who've been out there chapping on doors, they're not going away. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful legacy for us.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a bunch of positives and a bunch of negatives. I tend to look at any scenario and you say, right, has this happened before, and what happened? Or does it happen somewhere else, and what does it look like? Because you don't have to think about this stuff in a vacuum. And almost, it's amazing, it's almost everything you come up with in this debate. You can say, right, they do it like that in this country, or this happened in the past in this place, and you've got an example to look at. And this one's a great one, because you've got a scenario in the past where we had a yes vote, and you've got a scenario in the past where we had a no vote, or it was a yes vote, but it didn't happen, effectively a no vote. So the answer is, if it's a yes vote, it's going to be like what happens at the Scottish Parliament up, and the optimism and the progress that come on the back of that. If it's a no vote, it's going to be like 1979. And the depression, and very likely the economic consequences as well, because you're going to see, and this Obama thing, you run through what Boris Johnson says, what Priti Patel, the Treasury Minister, says, what, as I mentioned, the poll, 12% of people in the rest of the UK think we should continue to get more public spending than they do, despite the fact that we more than pay for it with our taxes. So all of that's lining up, right? At the end of the day, the atmosphere in London, on the corridor power, and in general, sense of the UK is they're fed up hearing about Scotland. Right? The last thing they're going to do is devote parliamentary time and effort and energy to have another big debate about what's going to happen in terms of giving Scotland more powers. They're going to say, thank God that's over, put it back in a box, and let's go and talk about something important like Nigel Farage or something like that. That's where the focus is going to be. So there's going to be a political consequence to get zero attention and zero time, but as and more importantly, I find it very, very difficult to believe there isn't going to be significant financial consequences as well. Having said all of that, there is that huge energy that's there that needs to be harnessed. And looking at it, take a step up from that, if you look back, we've had a referendum, and then 17, 18 years with another referendum, and then 17, 18 years with another one, and at every point we're moving down the process. I think independence is inevitable, because the confidence has grown, the understanding of issues is vastly superior to what it was even 2 years ago, never mind 15 years ago, and that will continue. There are scenarios where that could happen on that kind of time scale, 15 years away. There are scenarios where it could happen an awful lot quicker. For example, the rest of the UK voted to come out of the EU. I would think at that point Scotland, especially if Scotland voted for it and they voted against it, to say, hold on a minute, this is what we signed up for. And I think the promises that have been made by certain people in the road campaign that in reality aren't going to happen in terms of maintaining public spending in Scotland and more powers, etc. They're going to have huge credibility issues. So
the good news is it's going to be a yes vote, so we won't need to worry about that.
In terms of that part of the question, very short answer. If you look at what Norway's done, the Oslo Agreement, the Instrumental Drive in the Middle East, etc., 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 and what other small countries have done, a bunch of great stuff in international relations and soft power, we're ideally placed to do a whole bunch of that stuff.
And can I just add to that, though, that if we look at what's happened in the past, I do a lot of EU and UN kind of work, and it was really my observation that for the few, because I came right after.
Marsha, can we try this again, because there are one or two people that are struggling to hear.
Okay, just that I think certainly with the women's organizations, which is the area that I'm most familiar with, post-evolution, there was we were so engaged in the business of the Scottish Parliament and of creating a new Scotland around the devolution settlement, that I think we really took our eyes off of the international communities. And it's always been difficult for Scotland, and particularly in terms of the UN and EU, for women's issues to be distinct, because things are very different in Scotland. And for instance, in violence against women, they have been very different for 15 years, and in Scotland versus the rest of the country. But getting that to be reflected in the way the UK has interacted with UN bodies and EU bodies has been impossible pretty much until, maybe about 5 years ago. And that was when, 5 or 6 years ago, and that was when I think people's confidence about understanding and negotiating what we needed to do in Scotland allowed us to lift our heads up and look again outward to the world. And as a result, Scotland, the CEDAW committee has commended work that's been happening in Scotland to the UK government and said this is the kind of thing you should be looking at doing instead of your lack of progress on A, B, and C. And one of the things I worry about, because it was really hard fought to get that visibility, is that if we get a yes, that we're going to turn our heads back down to the independence task and forget that we have links and learning that can be done if we stay in the international community. So just one of the things I would say is when after the yes vote, I adopted Jean Urquhart's phrase, after the yes vote, what we need to do is try and remember that while we have great tasks in front of us in Scotland, we have a real opportunity and responsibility internationally too.
I'm, as a political scientist by academic background, I've been tracking what's been happening, and I'm still optimistic that there will be a yes vote. But if there's a no vote, it's something that we all have to face very seriously, because it's a distinct possibility. I find that I've never been particularly in favour of 40% rules. I particularly hated the 40% rule in 1978. But I'm toying with the idea of introducing a new one, which is that if we get more than 40% of the population voting yet, and 40% is obviously so important in UK constitutional matters, then we should say, you know, that, well, effectively, of course, we must have won, because that's the counterpart of the 1978 referendum. But even if they say, no, we haven't won, my response will be, okay, well, we didn't win, because 40% rules don't really work. But 1 million and more people have just voted saying they don't want to be in your country. You have a crisis, and you have a duty to sort this out. And simply trying to sling more powers to the Scottish Parliament is not going to sort it out. All, in fact, that throwing more powers to Holyrood would do, in my view, is this. It would unbalance the United Kingdom even more, which would probably lead on, if we did silly things like leave the EU, to another referendum in short order. The fact of the matter is, if we have a no vote, there are some of us, and I'm going to be amongst them, I can assure you, who are prodding and saying, right, well, during the debate, some of you started to understand that a federation of equal nations is what the UK claims to be and isn't. And it's about time that you started directing your efforts not to giving out more powers, but to dealing with the English question about the Government of England and its Parliament as an equal partner in the United Kingdom. And if you can seriously do that, then you never know, I might even vote for you next time round. But there's no evidence that it's being done. There's no evidence that they understand federalism properly. And if, for those reasons, I think that we can achieve federalism much better inside the European Union. And that brings me on to the foreign policy issue. I think that inside the European Union, you know, I'll be arguing for Scotland to be arguing against corporate control, against the trade treaty they're just about to sign with the United States of America and NAFTA. I'll be arguing that they take climate change seriously. It'll be back to getting into the things that we really need to discuss. Because in my view, climate change is 10 times more threatening than constitutional change. It's a serious issue, and we in Scotland have been diverted. I resent just how much of my life and energy has been spent debating the Constitution. A yes vote for me represents the best chance that I can spend my few remaining years actually discussing the big stuff, the real stuff, the important stuff, and actually having a voice in the world, actually having a voice where our views are actually given at the United Nations and in the European Union. And I want to see the Scottish Defence Force taking part in UN peacekeeping missions. I want us to be doing valuable work and producing useful, brilliant ideas the way that we can to make this not just a better country, but a better planet too.
Okay, folks, any final questions?
Well, yes, actually, I've got one for Ivan, and it's going back to this business of oil. Sir Ian Wood last week revised the forecast downwards quite substantially, and he appeared to contradict what he himself has said a few months earlier. And we have the oil industry contradicting him, the British government contradicting almost everybody in sight. Who on earth is the general public supposed to believe?
I would listen to the oil companies who invested 14 billion in the oil sector in Scotland last year. That's what I would listen to. There's money to be made. They don't do that unless there's money to be made. And if you go up to Aberdeen, I went up there 3 or 4 times on this tour, and you can't move for diggers digging holes in fields to do office blocks up for oil companies to put other people in. So it's booming. kind of shows where they think what's happening and where it's going.
Okay. Can I give an answer on that, which is radically different?
Yes, I'm sure.
I wouldn't trust an oil corporate as far as I could throw them. I wouldn't trust an oil corporate as far as I could spit them. And I'm not impressed by their £14 billion worth of development. The United Nations set up the International Panel on Climate Change, and the best scientists in the world tell us that if we burn more than 20% of the already known reserves of fossil fuels, we will go over the threshold of 2% increase in climate, and we will have catastrophic climate change. They, the oil corporates, intend to spend burn not 20% of that fossil fuel. If they can get away with it, they will burn 100%, and we will have utterly catastrophic climate change for our grandchildren. So I think actually that this whole debate on both sides, the SNP and the unionist side, the SNP and the nationalist and the yes side, and the unionist and the no side, are both arguing on completely the wrong terms. And if I had advice to give to Scotland, I would tell it this: get out of fossil fuels while you can. There is a bubble that is going to burst, because those companies, those huge corporates, are all capitalised on the basis of the known reserves that we can't burn. Those are stranded assets. This is a bigger financial bubble that we are facing. Across the whole globe, not just in Scotland, across the whole globe, a huge financial bubble that makes the 2008 collapse look like a picnic on the beach. We are in serious problems with climate change. It's about time we started addressing it and investing further and deeper and faster. I'm very proud of our record on investment in renewable energy, and I think Scotland is showing the way to go. Don't go down the nuclear avenue, don't go down the fossil fuel avenue, let's go down the avenue of new technologies, clean technologies and good technologies, and share them with the rest of the world. And the debate about oil, for me, is completely false, because we cannot burn all the oil that creates all this money. And we don't have many decades left to sort this problem out. And I want us to be able to get on to the real arguments about these issues. Believe me, I don't think that the fossil fuels in the North Sea or onshore that they're going to frack out or whatever are going to provide a nirvana and a panacea. They're not. We're going to have to find new ways, and we're going to have to use our intelligence to do so, rather than continued greed for fossil fuels which are destroying our planet. Sorry to disagree violently.
Okay, I think we have exhausted you, or at least your questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you just to put your hands together and thank our panel for tonight? Remember though, all you've heard tonight is perspectives. The power on the 18th is all of us equal. Each individual has the same vote with the same power. So you have to think about what your priorities are. Because that's what this is really about. As was said at the front here, it's about us choosing to be independent. And then all of these issues we will decide. I feel like that's the rap kicking in again. I know that's my pacemaker. It's your decision, right? Government is like life. You pick your own priorities. That's what independence is about, being allowed to pick our own priorities. And if you would like to give any small donations at the back, it will help pay for our costs. There are also some leaflets and information down the side. And if you are local and would like to get involved in the last few weeks of the campaign, we would love to see you at one of our meetings or on the street or wherever it may be. But thanks very much for coming tonight.